Good morning. Welcome to the King Institute for Faith and Culture this morning. As part of our convocation series, for the next couple of weeks, we're going to have invited speakers from outside. Next week, we welcome David Zoll, who's a theologian and pastor in Charlottesville, Virginia. If you're interested in his work in advance, look up Mockingbird Ministries, and you'll find some great stuff that he's done. I also want to let you know a couple of housekeeping details for today's visit with David Painter. We're going to, following the morning lecture, we're going to go over to the Tadlock House and have some coffee and snacks. If you'd like to come over and spend some time with David, please do. And we'll be there for about an hour, and then he's going to speak in Professor Helt's class after that. We're going to go over to lunch around 12:30, and again, if you want to drop by, feel free. Tonight at 6 p.m., he will be at the Bristol Public Library, where he's going to delve in a little more deeply into his own research, and that'll be in conjunction with the Bristol Historical Association. David was actually a student here. He was just telling me that for 4 days a week, when he was a student at King, you were required to come to chapel in this very building. 4 days a week. Think about that. And you had to get some proof that you had been at church on Sunday. You think 10 is bad. This is a much worse thing. After college here, having grown up in Meadowview, Virginia, David won something called a Rhodes Scholarship. He is the only King student thus far to have received one. This allows you to go to Oxford or Cambridge, or just Oxford after graduation, where he spent some years. It's an auspicious day today to be having his lecture, because today is a day called the Feast of St. Michael. And in England, it gets called Michaelmas, and this is the beginning of Michaelmas term. So it's an appropriate moment because this is the day he would have been beginning classes over in Oxford. He returned to the United States, went to the University of North Carolina for a PhD, and he has done a great deal of different kinds of things. He worked for the Congressional Research Service in Washington, D.C. He worked for the Department of Energy. He worked for the Department of State, all as a historian, and then moved over to Georgetown University in D.C., where he taught for many years in history. David's expertise is something that mirrored my predecessor at King, who was his professor, Dr. Tom Peake. Tom is somebody who came here after doing a PhD on the early 20th century, and he enmeshed himself in the history of his own times. He taught himself Russian. He began to teach Russian history. He also became intimately familiar with the civil rights movement. And he has a book on the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that's still in print. And like this, David, when he dove into graduate studies, looked for the history of his own time, and this was right in the middle of an oil crisis. And so he began to enmesh himself in the world of oil and foreign policy and the Cold War. And this has become the theme of his work. I have here just handed to me his Cold War introduction with Routledge Publishers, and The Struggle for Iran, which only came out a couple of years ago. The theme for this year, for our speaker series, is resourcefulness. It's kind of a vague term, but this, it seems to me, is an interesting way into resourcefulness for a couple of reasons. One is that we are talking about a natural resource, oil, and the difference that that makes to the way that international relations played out. But also history as a resource is interesting, and I want to finish just by giving you a little bit of the conclusion of this book, The Struggle for Iran. History, says David, is not just about the past. Learning how the world got to be the way it is and the forces that govern its evolution is essential to understanding the present and preparing to face the future. To tell us about history as a resource, please welcome David Painter.
Is this? Use this one.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, good. That's good. I was 300 students. That's probably about what we have here. So, yeah, and it was 4 days a week in chapel. And you did sign in, yeah, so, okay. I won't tell any more stories for now. I can tell you lots of stories later. I told Martin some stories about some incidents that happened when I was here. We had, I guess my favorite one was when somebody we didn't like, the Great Pumpkin came to visit him and on Halloween night, and the Great Pumpkin was a hollowed out pumpkin full of shaving cream with cherry bomb inside, which was rolled into his room and the door shut. That got a lot of people in trouble. It got me a start on the basketball team because they blamed the 2 starting guards who didn't do it. But I got to start for 5 seconds on the basketball team. Understanding the Cold War, most of you were born after the Cold War more or less 1945 to 1990, so you're a lot later. I lived through it, and at the time, it wasn't clear that we would live through it. I remember Cuban Missile Crisis, and foolishly thinking, I was delivering newspapers as a kid, thinking, well, maybe they won't come today because the world's ended. And I thought, well, it doesn't matter if the papers come, if the world has already ended. And then, of course, you've probably heard the story. They showed you a film called Duck and Cover. If you saw a bright flash, it was an atomic bomb going off, and you hide under your desk at school, hide under a wooden desk. So little things like that, yeah, they sort of reminded you that you could die anytime. So it was good. I think at the time, I would probably estimate 50-50 chance of making it through. But we did. It could have been worse, could have been better. And to study it, so one reason to study it, so maybe it'll be better, we can make it better in the future. So the Cold War was a lot of things. And one of the things that I try to do is look at not just a bipolar contest between the US and the Soviet Union, but look at a global transformation after a very tumultuous first half century where you had World War I, you had the Russian Revolution, you had dissolution of all these empires. Then you had a lot of other empires in threat, you had the Great Depression, and then you had World War II. Not a great time to be alive. It was pretty rough. So it was a conflict between the 2 great powers in a bipolar world, the US and the Soviet Union. There have been 4 other great powers before then: Germany, Japan, Britain, and France. But not actually Britain and French, the British Empire and the French Empire. Because if you ever wonder how a middling little country like England ruled the world, they didn't. It was the British Empire. And when they lost the empire, they ceased being a great power. But it was also an arms race, and that was the scary part because of nuclear weapons. Fortunately, they've only been used twice, and they were fairly small compared to what they later developed. But you had an arms race, and that was very scary because there was always the fear that one side or the other would make a technological breakthrough and decide, let's just get rid of these guys. And that was always scary because there was a big scare at the end of the 50s when the Soviets sent up Sputnik, the first satellite. And if you could put a satellite in space, you could do an intercontinental ballistic missile, which you can't stop. You may remember, you probably don't remember, actually Reagan tried to build they called it Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative, to shoot down missiles on the way. It was a great idea. We still can't do that. So that didn't work. So you get the world divided into 2 blocks, political, military blocks. And, the Cold War comes after the Great Depression. You think we've had some bad times? 25% unemployment in the Great Depression. Most every government in the world, either they were overturned. This was global. It wasn't just the US and the developed countries. What they called underdeveloped and colonial countries had it much harder. And then during World War II, you have economic warfare and economic controls. So you really you had to rebuild and reform the world economy. Then you had what I call transnational ideological conflict. World War II was sort of divided the far right, fascist, Italy, Germany, and Japan, against the liberal powers, Britain, France, and the U.S., not Britain and France, liberal at home, not really in their empire, and then the left. And so the world split, the left and the center fought against the right and defeated them. But that was not only the left and center internationally, it was also left and center within countries. And the fear was if a country went communist, then they would align themselves with the Soviet Union. Or if you kept the country capitalist, it would stay with the West. So there was a great fear, that sort of conflict went above and on. And of course, this is an aftermath of a lot of ideological conflict. I mean, fascism, communism, Bolshevism, colonialism. This is pretty rough times. And then, I keep on mentioning it, this was also when the world was still mostly colonial. The third world, where there were colonial powers, are powers like Iran or China, which are nominally independent, but are under special controls by outside powers. So I'll give an example of that. I'm just going to jump ahead, if I can. Where's the jump ahead button? Okay. There's the world in 1959. You can see the Soviet Union is that big brownish thing. And then you have China, what's that next over there that looks like? Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Yemen. But most of the world is either the dark colors are NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or colonies. And that's 1959. You go just a little bit later, in 1962, most of those colonies are now free. They're independent now. Free is another term. So, it was a very different world, and it's a world it's sort of hard to imagine today. And in some ways, that's good. Colonialism was not a good thing. But the reason I like the Cold War, it really shaped it wasn't the only thing going on. Decolonization's going on. A lot of things are going on. But it shaped most everything that went on. Divided the world into political, military, and economic blocs. You used to call it the Soviet bloc or the communist bloc and the free world. And, rough. The colonial powers weren't free. You had helped the U.S. become a superpower. The term superpower was coined in 1944, and when the guy did it, he said there were three superpowers: the U.S., Soviet Union, and the British Empire. That one didn't quite make it. It perpetuated communist rule in the Soviet Union. It's hard to believe that communism was ever popular, but in World War II, most of the peoples of the Soviet Union, Russians and other nationalities, were attacked by the Germans, who were very brutal, and they had a sort of patriotic and nationalistic reaction. So they actually looked good for a while. Sort of good. Not real good. Stalin was not nice. It divided nations in Europe and Asia. You guys don't remember, there used to be East Germany and West Germany. The German Democratic Republic and the Federal Republic. The German Democratic Republic was the not very democratic East Germany. I visited, 69 and 71. Went to East Berlin, East Germany as a student. And very different. West Germany was very different. Divided Korea, and there's still North Korea and South Korea. Divided Vietnam, North and South. So it really had a big impact in that sense. Really distorted priorities. I know President Eisenhower said, for the cost of an airplane, these bombers, we could build a school. And so, countries felt they had to spend a lot of money to defend themselves because they didn't trust the other side. So that really distorted priorities. It made all the tensions harder. It wasn't just political tensions. If you called somebody a communist because you didn't agree with them, that was pretty bad. Or if you called somebody a capitalist tool on the other side, that was even worse. You might get a free vacation in Siberia. I haven't been to Siberia. I've been to Russia in the winter, and it's even colder in Siberia. So, and then, it made everything more violent. It really complicated decolonization because these countries, most of the people who are becoming independent are either British, French, Japanese, Portuguese, Dutch had a colony. Anybody know what the Dutch colony was? It's present-day Indonesia, little tiny Netherlands. Indonesia is a lot bigger, and a pretty violent war of independence. So these wars of independence. So, we didn't have any war. There's one historian, we don't get along, who called this the long peace. There were no wars between the big powers. Nothing like World War II, where 55 million people were killed. But 20 million, more or less, in the wars, Korea, Vietnam, and then lots and lots of smaller wars. They killed a lot of people in the 70s in Central America. They don't show up because there are not many people there to start out with. As percentages of the population, Nicaragua took a big hit, El Salvador, Guatemala. It was very, very bad. And it shaped the way we think about international relations today. Now people worry about China, and they talk about a new Cold War with China. And we'll say a few things about that at the end. There's a competition with China. Hopefully, it won't become a Cold War, because Cold War is not a good thing. So, I tried to think ways to deal with this, because it's very, you can imagine something this big is controversial. So people were, disagreeing. Was it part of a long war against totalitarianism? First against the Russian Bolshevism, and then fascism, the free world against totalitarianism. Or just against communism. Or was it two great powers? International system sorting out, you have two continental-sized powers. They're fighting who's going to be the top. It's a bipolar world. It was sort of a bipolar world. The Soviets were never in the game. They were incomplete superpower. They started out behind. They ended up behind. They never really caught up. Was the U.S. forced to assume a great power role, a superpower, leader of the free world? Or was this sort of similar to what the U.S. had been doing? I remember talking to a foreign student at Georgetown once, talk about U.S., it's not that big. Since it started out pretty small, 13 colonies, and then a whole continent, and then picked up Alaska, Hawaii. Philippines was a colony for a long time. Puerto Rico still is. But and what I'm saying, it's both. These are not necessarily one or the other. You have to do the nuances between them. With Soviet policy at the time, they're communist expansion, aggression. They used to have these maps, and the Soviet Union would turn red. And then the flood would move over in Eastern Europe and move down into China, and what's next? Or was the Soviet policy, were they really just Russians scared of being invaded again by the Germans? There's a famous movie about this, about a battle between Teutonic Knights and Russian patriots somewhere in the Middle Ages. I couldn't get this straight. And it's sort of they make the Teutonic Knights look like Nazis. But it's sort of to say, we don't have any secure borders. We've been invaded by the Mongols. We've been invaded by the Germans. And if you don't believe it, think about World War I and World War II. How many people did the U.S. lose in World War II? 410,000. That's a lot of people. How many people did the Soviet Union lose? 25 to 27 million. That's a lot more. Everybody lost somebody. And I remember I have a friend who's a Russian. He teaches in Britain now. He's taught in the U.S. He's born in Russia. And he wrote, it wasn't until the generals who could remember the cities burning, when they left power, then we could start thinking about doing things differently. So if you've seen the cities burning and people getting killed, it's sort of natural to be worried about having a buffer zone in Eastern Europe between you and Germany, having a buffer zone between you and Japan, who's also you've had wars with, lost a big war with Japan, 1904, 1905, fought battles with them in 1941. So most of the early histories of the Cold War focused on Europe. Division of Germany, East and West, Warsaw Pact versus, that's the Soviet version of NATO, the Warsaw Pact. NATO was formed in 1949, the Warsaw Pact in 1955. Why later? That's when Germany gets its independence. The Russians were always more worried about the Germans than the Americans. It's really funny because you think, well, the Germans were defeated, divided. Stalin once said, give them another 15 years and they'll kill off another generation of us. So they were worried. And I think you should look at the whole world and look at what were the wars, the big wars in the Cold War? Korea was a colony of Japan from 1910 to 1945. So the part of the Korean War is decolonization, getting the Japanese out and then trying to have independence. But it was occupied in the north by the Soviets and the south by the U.S., and each side set up their own government. So you had a civil war in Korea before you got the actual Korean War. The other big war is the Vietnam War, and that's French colonialism. When I was in high school, a teacher set up a debate about should the U.S. be in Vietnam? And I was signed to say yes. So my mother was the librarian, so I read up in Time and Newsweek and got all this, and I was ready to go. And the other side that said U.S. shouldn't be was my best friend, whose father was a history professor at Emory and Henry. And the debate starts out, and he talks about French colonialism. And I said, what? None of the stuff I had read talked about French colonialism. And this is where it all started with French colonialism. The first Vietnam War was against the French, and then the second Vietnam War, the Americans, from the point of view of Vietnamese nationalists, most nationalists, not all nationalists, were successors to the French. So, this is sort of important. A lot of wars, most of the deaths in the wars were in what people used to call the Third World. They also now call it the Global South. It's the poorer countries, many former colonies. So there's a lot going on. And then, of course, you see in the global, I did the 5 different things with the Cold War, and I look at 5 categories. First one, I look at the global balance of power. And basically, U.S. starts out ahead. U.S. isn't destroyed in World War II like most places. Our economy doubles in size. We have all the world's gold. We have oil. We have technological lead. We have secure borders. What are the great threats on our borders? As one guy said, what are on the U.S. borders? You have Canada, Mexico, fish, and fish. And then I had a student in a paper say, U.S. was surrounded by the great fishing powers of Canada and Mexico. That's why I use some printed word as well. They're both great fishing powers, but that's not the point. Whereas the Soviet Union doesn't have really secure borders. You have all these borders where you have different ethnic groups mixing over and with different allegiances, and they've been invaded many times in their past. So they're sort of insecure. Now, the way they've reacted to it is to take over other places, and of course that makes the people on the other side insecure too. The fish, they probably mind it, but they don't tell us. And what the Canadians say, being next to the U.S. is like sleeping near an elephant. If it turns over, you're in big trouble. The Mexicans say, what is it? Pobre Mexico, tan cerca, tan lejos de Dios, tan cerca de los Estados Unidos. Poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States. And if you look at a map, Mexico used to be a lot bigger. California and Texas, Arizona and New Mexico. That's, I'm trying to, Soviet Union, I said incomplete. They actually had a lot of ideological appeal. A lot of people thought communism, or socialism at least, the wave of the future, and that's a reaction against fascism. And then a lot of countries, with one big exception, the resistance to German occupation or Japanese occupation was led by communists. Well, there's 2 exceptions. The Polish resistance was not. They were very anti-Soviet as well as anti-Russian as well as anti-German. In Indonesia, you had some nationalists who were non-communist. But largely, a lot of people thought they didn't know about all the purges and the death camps and all the stuff in the 30s because that was shut down. So a lot of people thought, hey, this is not too bad. And you get a lot of kids in Latin America, the first name is Stalin or Lenin, and you think, that's not a very Spanish-sounding name. But it was because they fought against the Nazis. George Kennan, a famous U.S. diplomat, once said there are 5 centers of power in the world. He said the U.S., United Kingdom, Western Europe, Soviet Union, and Japan. And as long as we stay in control of 4 of them, we're fine. Well, if you look toward the end of the Cold War, there's still 5 centers. It's the U.S. and the European Union, and that was actually when UK was in it. But the European Union, Russia, China now, and Japan. And so China comes up, Britain drops out, and then one of the big things in the Cold War is when the Chinese turned and the Russians got after each other. It started in 1959, the Sino-Soviet split. Once that happened, the fact that the chance the Russians are going to take over the world, 0 or less. That was the only chance, and that didn't work out. And then Germany and Japan are reintegrated into the West as democratic states, pro-US. That's a big change. And then they managed decolonization, so there's always the fear that countries would turn communist if they became free, like in Vietnam, which happened, Laos and Cambodia eventually. But basically, they contained that threat. In the 1950s, really scary, they weren't sure what's going to happen with the Middle East, with Arab nationalism in the Middle East, especially with Nasser. Nobody remembers Nasser, died in 1970. But he was sort of a spokesman, Egyptian leader, but for all of Arab nationalists because he had Cairo radio. That's when radio was big. You remember radio, right? No. Okay. So the balance of power over time, there was always a fear that the Soviets would get ahead. They never did. And one of the big things is they didn't have good allies. The Eastern European countries in their sphere of influence don't like them. They're dominated by them, where most of the Western European countries, we were good friends. So allies were really important. It wasn't the U.S. versus the Soviet Union. It's the Western Bloc. And when you did the Western Bloc versus the Soviet Bloc, they're behind. And then when China was on their side, sort of, it wasn't a great power. And when it becomes a great power, it's not on their side. So that's one way to look at it. Another way, technology of warfare. This is, I know my students say, this is a guy thing, right? Bombs and bullets and stuff like that. This is important. We don't think about it. It's good you probably don't think about it. You don't have nightmares about it like people in our generation did. You could destroy the world. There are enough nuclear weapons. Once the hydrogen bomb, there's the atomic bomb, which is fission, and the hydrogen bomb, which is fusion. Any physicists here? It's much more powerful. Some people say that the step from the atomic bomb to the hydrogen bomb is a bigger step from conventional bombs to the atomic bomb. These things, the one that blew up Hiroshima was 20 kilotons. The biggest test, the Russians did one in the 60s, the Tsar bomb. Why would the Soviets name something the Tsar bomb? I'm not sure. 150 megatons. You can literally, in the 50s, they figured out, we can destroy the world. We better not have a nuclear war. There's a famous strategist who says, the job of the military for years, for centuries, was how to win wars. He said the job of the military now has to be how to avoid wars, because there's no other thing that's more important. And, it's scary. And in the 50s, Eisenhower in the U.S., Khrushchev in the Soviet Union, these guys figured out, we better not have a war, because nobody's going to win. We're going to destroy so much, nobody will win. But there was always the fear that it would happen. There were accidents. There's a famous case where somebody put in a test case in the Soviet computers that looks like, here come the missiles from the U.S., and he's got 30 seconds to decide to retaliate, and he says, no, I'm not going to do it. And fortunately, he didn't. He could have. So there was always that problem. And then, over time, technology makes it weapons get bigger, they get more accurate. You have intercontinental, now we have glide missiles, hypersonic glide missiles, which are even faster. Soviet Union to the US, US to Soviet, we fly over Canada, and the Canadians love that one, and the North. Well, maybe 30 minutes after launch. Well, during the 80s, we deployed missiles in Germany, 9 minutes from West Germany to Moscow. That scared them. That scared them a lot. So, that's a big problem, and it was always fear of a first strike. The other side would go first, wipe out your ability to retaliate, and you're gone. And the Soviets said, we're never going to do a first strike. The U.S. says, we can't renounce a first strike. That was a policy. The military says you either go first or you don't go, which is actually true. But this was always a fear that technological change would give one country an advantage, and maybe they wouldn't do it intentionally, but in a crisis, they might. 1983, there was a war scare. The Soviets thought maybe the U.S. was going to attack them. Reagan was talking about bombing the Soviet Union and all this stuff. And we had this big war game planned where troops would move around in Europe. And the Soviets thought maybe they'll just do this war game and then, and they got scared. And when Reagan found out they were scared, he says, why were they scared? I would never do that. And he said, but I finally understood they thought I might. And so, that was a big thing. Reagan they just did a whole bunch of documents on the Reagan years. And Reagan, I think, really, except for his rhetoric, really understood nuclear war was bad. He wanted to get rid of nuclear weapons, that it wasn't safe. Somebody's going to make a mistake. And I'll hand that to him. Also, geography. Soviet Union was surrounded by hostile countries. The U.S. isn't. The only thing that we got scared of, well, obviously an intercontinental ballistic missile, that's after, let's see, Sputnik is 1957, and we thought the Russians, there was a missile gap. They'd have all these missiles. They had 4. But this is before we had satellites that could fly over the Soviet Union and see them. Once we found out, we said, wow, that's pretty good. But once we found out, we let them know that we knew. We knew how many they had. We knew where they were. And they took it to mean, we're going to attack you. And that's why they put missiles in Cuba, for the Cuban missile. They also thought we were going to invade Cuba. Why would they think that? Oh, wait, we did. We invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. So we sponsored people invading. So, there's always the problem that somebody will make a mistake. I know during the Cuban Missile Crisis, a U.S. destroyer dropped depth charges on a Soviet submarine so it would surface. That's what the book says to do. Kennedy had told him not to do this, and he says there's always some bleep, 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 who doesn't get the message. And they also had a U-2 flight. U-2s were surveillance planes that was scheduled to fly over the Soviet Union. They just let it go, and the Soviets said, they're planning an attack. So that was a really close call. That was 1962. It peaks in 1985. Look at the number of nuclear warheads available in 1985, 61,000. Now, I lived in Meadowview, Virginia. Directions from here, you go in the middle of nowhere and turn left. There may be 800 people. I don't think we ever got on the targeted list. I think Bristol was. When they had this many, maybe they were on that. We finally got it. We're still 12,000. There's 9 nuclear powers. There's U.S., Soviet Union, Britain, France, China. Okay, there's 5. Pakistan and India. Israel. South Africa had them for a while, but North Korea. And that's a problem. Somebody could make a mistake. Now, generally, people know if I make a mistake and blow up the U.S. or Soviet Union, they will blow me up, and what have I gained? But, we're dealing with human beings and not necessarily always rational. And then, to make it work, this is part of overall distrust. Of course they'll do it. We're enemies. They're going to try to gain an advantage. And then, my specialty, oil. Most of your weapon systems, platforms, still run on oil. World War II, Everything ran on oil until the end with the nuclear weapons. Now, once you get ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons, oil is not as important, but most of the ships, except for aircraft carriers and submarines, are oil-powered. Tanks are oil-powered. Jeeps, most of your weapons, so that's big. It didn't work out in the global south. They actually made out pretty well not having weapons because Vietnamese, they were fighting in jungles. That helped. Didn't help the Iraqis since they were fighting in the desert and there's no tree cover. But you had peasant armies could hold their own, at least defensively. So technology of warfare in some ways deterred war because people knew it would be a disaster. On the other hand, it made people a lot more nervous that something could go wrong. And so they kept on building, from 2 in 1945 to 61,622 in 1985, bigger, better, more destructive. That's a pretty big one. Global economy, look at all these, you have to look at the background, global depression, and then wartime destruction and controls and disruption. So it needs to be reformed as well as rebuilt. And that was a big thing. And in the West, we had, people call it the golden age of capitalism. The French call it the 30 glorious years of economic growth. And, U.S. had already done a lot, so, 4% on a much bigger economy, still pretty good. Japan did really well. Western Europe did well. Britain, not as well. Some of it is arms spending. Keynesianism is doing deficit spending to stimulate the economy. Military Keynesianism is doing spending on the military. If you're from around here, remember Radford had the Radford Arsenal. They did well. Raytheon, all these military contractors, a lot of employment. U.S. over time declines relatively. We're in 50% of the world economy in 1945. We grew during the war. Everybody else got thumped. So we're down to 20%. Relative decline. It's still a much larger economy. And then Western Europe and Japan are on our side. And next, newly industrializing countries. South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. They were the big growth people after East Asia. Whose side are they on? Our side. Did the Soviets have anybody on their side that grew well? No. Not until later. China, in most of this period, China does a lot of self-inflicted wounds. The Great Leap Forward killed 25 million people because it happened in the middle of a drought and a famine. And then the Cultural Revolution messes everything up. They finally get out of all that. And in Eastern Europe, and Soviet Union, Eastern Europe grew a lot in the 1950s, mostly reconstruction. Once they got the reconstruction done, they didn't grow. They had what people called extensive growth. You build in the same technology rather than intensive, developing new technology. So they were never competitive. I don't know if any of you guys ever seen the East German car, the Trabant. It's in movies and comics. It had a 2-cycle engine, a fiberglass body, and when they burned to the ground. Terrible cars. The Yugoslav's a good one. The Yugo, you ever seen a Yugo? I saw a Yugo once in Slovakia, and it had a club, so it wouldn't be stolen. If you had a Yugo in the U.S., you would leave the keys in the car, put up a sign, "Steal this car." They were giant. They were about as bad as, there was a Chevy model once that said it started rusting before it left the showroom. That was the Chevy Vega. But anyhow, so the West, even though the U.S. relatively declines, the whole Western alliance grows much more powerful. The oil crises of the 70s, 80s, that's my thing. The oil crisis, causes problems, but in the long run, at first the Soviets, they were exporting oil. They made a lot more money. Middle East countries made a lot more money, and then they got the price of oil too high and encouraged production in other areas. And now the U.S. is a net exporter of oil. I think in 2005, the U.S. peaks, we were importing 60% of our oil. Now we actually export a tiny bit. but we no longer import oil. So that's a big change. And then, of course, the big shift, not only the big shift in the balance of power was China, the big shift in the world economy is China. Now, you think now it's China and China and China. China's not really a big player until the 90s and really the early 2000s. They start their economic reforms in the late 70s. But, well, you know, was it 1.3 billion people? And industrious, and they really have an industrial policy. So this really changes, it's an economic shift as well as a political shift. And again, this affects the Cold War because all this is helping us and hurting the Soviets, the other side of the Cold War. An ideological conflict, you know, I said the Soviets were popular, the US was popular. Franklin Roosevelt gave a famous speech about the 4 freedoms. Freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. He was a New Dealer. And so in the West, you know, after all this conflict, class conflict, strikes, fascists putting down workers, you know, all this stuff, and workers become communists, you have a welfare state of sorts set up in Western Europe and the United States, and you don't have the class conflict that you said. We still have conflict, and there's still strikes, but you don't have people shutting down the economy and stuff like this. So this is a big change. And then in Western Europe, you know, before the war, you had fascists, then you had the conservatives, then you had the Christian Democrats, then you had the social democrats, and then you had the communists. After the war, the fascists are defeated, the conservatives are discredited, and the center becomes the right. The Christian Democrats were, before World War II, and the Christian Democrats still around in Germany, were known as the Center Party. And so, but now they're the right, and then the Social Democrats are the left because nobody hates, the communists don't hate anybody more than they hate Social Democrats because they compete for the same voters or workers or whatever. So you really have a thing, and then the US, the New Deal saves capitalism, I mean, with 25% unemployment. And a lot of places, most people thought, hey, this isn't working. We got to do something else. Now, something else turned out to be more of a social democratic welfare state. The Germans call it a social market economy. That sort of takes that edge. In Japan, conservatives stay in power, but not the real hard-line guys, though some of them get back in power. And then over time, people, you know, actually existing communism turns out not to be real good. You know, everybody, there was the dream, but you have economic stagnation, human rights abuses, and environmental destruction. And people say, this is what we signed up for. And this really shows up in the generational change in the Soviet Union, Russia, and Eastern Europe. If you were born the first half of the century, and you went through World War I, the Russian Revolution, the Depression, and World War II, this doesn't look too bad. Your life has improved. I mean, the Soviets, for all their problems, did mass education. They had pretty good, but not great, health care. Education was the big one. You know, and you don't have this poverty and that you had. But over time, their reference group is not their parents. It's their counterparts in Western Europe and Japan, and they say, they're doing a lot better than we are. There's the famous thing when Gorbachev made a visit to the West and came back and said, we can't go on living like we are. You know, you guys don't remember Gorbachev, but he's the guy who ended the Cold War. He was a Russian reformer, great reformer in many ways, terrible economist. He also ruined the economy and caused the collapse of communism and socialism and everything else in the Soviet Union. And then the end of colonialism. You know, once these places become independent, you no longer have colonial wars of independence. And then one of the big ones, I'll get to it again later, decline of racism. I'm going to be very careful, because I'm going to mention the word Hitler. The only good thing Hitler ever did was make racism unpopular. In other words, racism was acceptable in, polite circles pretty much all over the world before World War II. Afterwards, people said, this is what racism leads to? No. That's not to say there weren't civil rights movements and things before, but the civil rights movement in the U.S., it actually fulfills what we say we're supposed to do. I know I had a guest speaker once who has written a lot about the Cold War, and when he came to speak, there was a big exhibition in Georgetown about the civil rights movement. He says, I just came here and saw why we won the Cold War. It's because we began to live up better. Not perfect, but nobody's perfect. But, that was a huge difference, that there's still a lot of problems, but it's not like it was before World War II. Your time is moving along. Okay, what are we? Ooh. So in the Global South, we have independence, and that didn't particularly work out. That's where the wars were, but they didn't, by and large, didn't go over. The only places the Soviets took over were the poor countries. Lessons, there were problems. It wasn't as bad as we thought. We didn't win by forcing them around. Really, what ended the Cold War is Gorbachev says, this isn't working, let's stop this. We can be secure without all these weapons. And so we survived. It was close, wasn't good. Thomas Hobbes, he once said, life is nasty, brutish, and short. The Cold War was nasty, brutish, and long. But we made it. Could have been worse. Understanding what happened is a step to doing better, and failing to learn has consequences. Now, I want to show one last thing about why study history. This was a poll done by political scientists. And if you wanted to be a policymaker, the best thing to study is history. And area studies, be expert in one part of the world. The worst thing is to be an IR guy. I used to post this at Georgetown, and the government department protested and had it taken down, but I can still do it here. So I went over a little long. I'm sorry. I know you guys got to get to class. If you want to hear some stories like the Great Pumpkin and other stories, or basketball team stories, I can tell you those later. Thank you.